Aurora Sterling had built an empire worth $4 billion. And tonight, a man she'd never met walked out on her before she could finish her first glass of water. Not because she'd done anything wrong, just because of what she was. She sat alone at the best table in the most exclusive restaurant in the city, surrounded by people pretending not to stare, and she made herself breathe. She was good at that, breathing through things that should have broken her, but this one cut differently. And the night wasn't even close to over. Hey tip. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Follow along so you don't miss a single moment. The reservation had been made under a fake name. That was Aurora's first mistake, letting Priya talk her into using an alias, as if pretending to be someone else for one evening was the same thing as actually being someone else. Priya had insisted. Just go as Rory. Not Aurora Sterling, not the CEO, not the woman who made the cover of Forbes 3 times before she turned 30. Just Rory. See what happens. What happened was that Aurora Sterling sat alone at a corner table in Maison Alara, a restaurant with a 6-week wait list and a sommelier who spoke to guests in a voice usually reserved for confessionals, and waited for a man named Marcus Webb to show up and decide what he thought of her. She had been waiting for 11 minutes when he arrived. She knew it was him immediately. Priya had sent a photo. He was good-looking in the way that men who knew they were good-looking always were. A little too composed walking through a room, eyes already scanning for confirmation that people had noticed him enter. He was wearing a jacket that cost more than most people's rent, and he carried himself with the particular ease of someone who had never once in his adult life been the least important person in a space. Aurora watched him cross the restaurant toward her table. She smiled. He stopped. Not a natural stop. Not the kind where someone pauses to get their bearings. This was the kind of stop where a person's face does something fast and involuntary. A flicker of recalibration, a tiny but complete reassessment happening behind the eyes. He had recognized her. Not Rory. Aurora Sterling. He knew exactly who she was, and whatever he had been expecting, it wasn't this. She kept the smile steady, stood up to greet him, because that was what you did. Marcus, she said. It's good to finally— You're Aurora Sterling, he said. Not a question, not even really a greeting, just a statement dropped onto the table like something heavy. Rory, she said, keeping her voice light. My friends call me Rory. He didn't sit down. That was the detail she would turn over later, lying in bed at 1 a.m, staring at the ceiling. He didn't even sit down. He stood at the edge of her table with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at her with an expression that was somehow worse than hostility. It was tired. Like she had already disappointed him, and they hadn't exchanged more than 10 words. Look, Marcus Webb said, you're a nice-looking woman, and I'm sure you're very successful. But I don't do this. Aurora's smile didn't move. Do what? This. He gestured vaguely at the table, at the restaurant, possibly at her entire existence. The whole auditioning thing, where I sit down and spend 2 hours trying to convince a billionaire that I'm interesting enough. He shook his head. Priya should have told me. I would have saved us both the time. Aurora said nothing. She was good at silence. She used it in boardrooms when someone said something stupid and needed to hear how stupid it sounded in the absence of agreement. She used it in negotiations when the other party needed to feel the weight of what they'd just proposed. She used it now because there was genuinely nothing she could think of to say that wouldn't come out wrong. Marcus Webb gave her a short nod, polite, final, already walking away in his head, and said, "Have a good night," and then he left. He walked back through Maison Alara the same way he'd come in, still easy, still composed, still the most important person in the room in his own estimation. And Aurora watched him go from her corner table while the sommelier hovered nearby pretending to study the wine list. She sat back down. She picked up her water glass. She set it down again without drinking. Fine, she thought. Fine. The thing about public humiliation is that it requires an audience to be truly effective, and Maison Alara was full of people who were extremely good at pretending they hadn't seen anything while having seen absolutely everything. Aurora could feel them in her peripheral vision. Not staring, never staring directly, but aware of her the way people are aware of a car accident on the side of the road. You don't look, but you know it's there. She thought about leaving. She ran the calculation in her head, standing up, gathering her things, walking out with her spine straight and her expression neutral, getting into the car that was idling at the curb, going home to her apartment where the kitchen was always spotless because she was never there long enough to make a mess of it. She thought about calling Priya to say exactly what she thought about this entire situation. She had thoughts. They were specific and not particularly kind. Instead, she ordered food. Not because she was hungry, because she refused to let a man who had decided she was too much before he'd even sat down also ruin her dinner. She ordered the sea bass and a glass of wine she didn't really want, and she ate alone at the best table in a full restaurant, and she was absolutely, completely fine. She was so fine that she ate approximately 6 bites before she pushed the plate away. She was so fine that she found herself staring at the window beside her table. Maison Elara had tall windows that looked out onto a quiet side street, watching the foot traffic outside with the studied disinterest of someone who was absolutely not thinking about Marcus Webb or his jacket or the look on his face when he realized who she was. That was when she saw them. A man was crouched down beside a car parked directly across the street, his phone flashlight aimed at something underneath the front bumper. Even from inside the restaurant, through the glass, she could see the posture of someone receiving bad news. Shoulders tight, head bent, that specific stillness of a person trying to stay calm while their brain was running through options and finding all of them bad. Standing on the sidewalk behind him was a little girl. She was maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a purple dress that was clearly the good dress. The kind of dress kids wear when something important is happening, stiff at the collar, slightly too formal. The kind of thing that gets laid out on the bed the night before. She had a small backpack shaped like a cat, and she was holding it with both hands in front of her, watching her father crouch beside the car with an expression that was trying very hard to be patient and brave and not at all worried. She was failing at it. The man stood up, ran a hand through his hair, and said something. The little girl's shoulders dropped about half an inch. Not a tantrum, not tears. Just the small, quiet collapse of someone who had been hoping for different news and had just had that hope taken away. He crouched back down. This time he was clearly on the phone, his free hand pressed flat against the car's hood. Aurora watched this for 30 seconds. Then she flagged down her server, had the check prepared, left enough cash to cover the meal and a tip that the server would remember for a while, and walked out the front door of Maison Elara into the cool evening air. Or she crossed the street. She wasn't sure exactly what she planned to say. She hadn't thought it through. That was unusual for her. Aurora was, by nature and by professional necessity, someone who thought things through. She modeled outcomes. She ran scenarios. She had a habit that her assistant Nadine called the Aurora pause. That moment in every meeting where she went very quiet before speaking because she was already 3 steps ahead and needed everyone else to catch up before she explained where they were going. She did not do the Aurora pause now. She just walked across the street in her good dress and her heels that were wrong for cobblestones, and she stopped a few feet from the man crouching beside the car and said, "Hey, car trouble?" He looked up. He was not what she expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. He was younger than she'd thought from a distance, maybe early 30s, with dark hair that was slightly too long and a face that looked like it had done a lot of living in not a lot of time. Not in a hard way, in the way of someone who had been tired and come out the other side of it and was still figuring out what that meant. He was wearing a button-down shirt that had been ironed and then thoroughly unironed over the course of the evening, and he was looking at her with the expression of a person who couldn't quite figure out why a woman in expensive clothes was talking to him. "Yeah," he said, straightening up. "Alternator, I think. Or the battery. Yeah, it's not going anywhere tonight." He had a voice that matched his face, a little rough, careful about being direct without being short. "You waiting for a tow?" "Already called. Hour and a half, maybe 2. He glanced back at the little girl. "We're good." The little girl looked at Aurora with the particular frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to pretend not to stare. Her gaze moved from Aurora's face to her dress to her shoes, and back to her face, gathering data. "I'm Sophie," the girl said. "Hi, Sophie," Aurora said. "I'm Rory." "That's a nickname." "It is. My full name is Sophie Grace Mercer, but everyone calls me Sophie, except my grandma. She calls me Gracie. I don't really like it, but I don't tell her that." "Sophie," the man said quietly. "I'm just talking." He looked at Aurora with an expression that was somewhere between apologetic and amused. "She's 8. She talks." "It's her birthday," Aurora said. Not a question. Something about the dress had made it obvious. The little girl's face went through several things quickly. First, surprise that the stranger had guessed, then the complicated pleasure of having your birthday acknowledged, and then something smaller and more careful underneath. The things she'd been carrying since her father had crouched beside the car with bad news. "We were going to Pescado," Sophie said, "for my birthday dinner. They have the shrimp pasta and they let you pick a dessert from the cart." "Sophie, I'm just telling her." She looked up at her father. "She asked." He hadn't asked, but Aurora understood the distinction. "Pescado's on 5th, Aurora said. "That's about a mile from here." "We'll figure it out," the man said. He had the tone of someone who said that sentence a lot. Not defeated, not dismissive, just the steady, slightly worn quality of a person who had become expert at figuring things out and no longer expected it to be easy. Aurora looked at the little girl in the purple dress with the cat backpack. She looked at the restaurant behind her. She thought about her empty table and her untouched sea bass, and the way the last 2 hours of her evening had gone. "I have a table inside," she said, "with food on it that I haven't touched. If you want it." The man stared at her. "It's a good restaurant," she added, "and it's her birthday." "We're not," he started. "Free," Aurora said. "Already paid for. I was leaving anyway." That part wasn't technically true. She waited. Sophie looked up at her father. She didn't say anything. She had clearly learned, at 8 years old, that there were moments when you said nothing and let the situation do the talking. The man looked at Aurora, then at Sophie, then back at Aurora. "Dylan Mercer," he said finally. "Rory," she said. She stuck out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and a little cautious, the handshake of someone who was still deciding whether this was a good idea. It was a deeply strange evening. That was the only honest way to describe it, looking back. Aurora Sterling, who had eaten at Maison Alara 6 times before and never once had the experience go sideways, now sat across from a man she had met 8 minutes ago and his 8-year-old daughter, who was currently informing the sommelier, very seriously, that she would like apple juice if they had it and water if they didn't. The sommelier brought her apple juice in a wine glass. Sophie inspected it and declared this acceptable. Dylan watched his daughter with an expression Aurora couldn't quite name. It was made up of several things: exhaustion, affection, something that might have been relief, something that might have been the specific kind of pride that doesn't announce itself. He had a way of paying attention to Sophie that was complete without being smothering, present without hovering. So, he said, once the server had brought a new order for the table and Sophie had become absorbed in the breadbasket with the focus of a scientist examining a specimen. "You were having dinner alone." "I was." "On purpose?" "In the end." He paused. "That mean you were supposed to be having dinner with someone?" "I was." She picked up her wine. He left. Dylan's expression didn't change much, but something shifted in it. He left. "Before we ordered." "That's..." He stopped, started again. "Was he an idiot, or did you do something?" Aurora laughed. It came out surprised, which was the only kind of laugh she trusted. "That's a very direct question." "I've got an 8-year-old, he said. "Direct questions are basically the only kind that survive in my house." "He decided I wasn't what he wanted," she said, before he really had any information to make that decision with. Dylan considered this. He turned his water glass in his hand. What was his reasoning? "He thought I'd be..." She paused, looking for the word. "Too much." Too much. Too successful. He said it felt like auditioning. Dylan was quiet for a moment. Did he say that, or did he act like it and then say something else? She looked at him. He said it, more or less directly. Huh. He took a drink of water. At least he was honest about it. That's a generous interpretation. I'm not saying it was okay, he said. I'm saying most people would have sat through the whole dinner and then ghosted you. He saved you 2 hours. Aurora thought about this. It was not, technically, wrong. He still walked out, she said. Yeah, he did. A small pause. That part's bad. Sophie looked up from the bread basket. Who walked out? Nobody you know, Dylan said. Was it a date? Sophie asked Aurora with the directness of someone who has nothing invested in social niceties. It was supposed to be. Did he have bad manners? Aurora thought about it. He had very specific manners for very specific situations, and I wasn't one of the situations he'd prepared for. Sophie absorbed this. My dad says manners are for everyone, or they're for no one. Your dad is right. Dylan looked faintly embarrassed in the way parents do when their children successfully weaponize something they said. I said that about a specific thing. You said it generally, Sophie said, with the confident finality of someone who had been taking mental notes. Aurora laughed again. It kept happening. That was the strange part, the way the evening kept producing moments that were genuinely, unexpectedly funny, not in a polished, performative way, but in the way that real things are funny when you're not trying. The food came. Dylan had ordered the salmon. Sophie had ordered the pasta. Not the shrimp pasta from Pescado, but the restaurant's version, which the server had confirmed was, in fact, very good, and had negotiated the dessert situation with the calm determination of someone conducting a business acquisition. She had been informed that Maison Alara did not have a cart, but they did have a chocolate fondant with sea salt, and after brief deliberation she had determined this was an acceptable substitute. Dylan ate with the efficiency of someone who was used to eating quickly, a habit, Aurora suspected, born of years of getting a kid fed and to bed and lunches made for tomorrow before he could sit down himself. He noticed her noticing and said without looking up, "Bad habit." "I eat at my desk," Aurora said. "At least you're at a table." "Is that what you do? Work?" "Most of the time." "What kind of work?" She'd told herself she'd say the same thing she always said in these situations. Investments, finance, nothing interesting. The kind of answer designed to close the topic without being a lie. But Dylan Mercer was looking at her with an expression that suggested he wasn't particularly interested in her job title, just in whether her answer was honest, and somehow that made the deflection feel worse than it usually did. "Finance, mostly," she said. "Capital allocation. I build things, and sometimes I buy things, and occasionally I take things apart when they're not working." "You like it?" She paused. It was not a question she got asked often. "Parts of it," she said. "I'm good at the parts I don't like, which is its own kind of problem." He nodded, like that made sense, like he'd had versions of that problem himself. "What about you?" she asked. "Structural engineer," he said. "Infrastructure, mostly. Bridges, load-bearing systems, the stuff that holds other stuff up. Do you like it?" He thought about it, seriously, not performatively. "Yeah, I like knowing things will hold, that what I did will matter in 20 years, 50 years. There's something," he paused, "solid about it." "Sophie," Aurora said, "does your dad's work bore you to tears, or have you developed a genuine interest in load-bearing systems?" Sophie looked up from her pasta. "He showed me a bridge once, a big one. He knew all the people who built it." A pause. "It was kind of cool." Dylan looked at his plate, but something moved in his face. "Kind of cool," he said. "Very cool," Sophie amended, "but I'm not saying that to his face because he gets too excited." "I do not get too excited. You talked about the bridge for 45 minutes in the car. It was a good bridge." Aurora was helplessly grinning. The dessert came. Sophie received the chocolate fondant with the seriousness of a state occasion. She cut into it carefully, and when the center ran chocolate, she looked up at Aurora with an expression that could only be described as vindicated. "It's good," she said. "The car breaking down doesn't seem so bad now." Aurora tried. Sophie considered this with the philosophical detachment of someone who was eating very good chocolate. Still bad, but less bad. Dylan flagged down the server and ordered Sophie a second dessert over her protest that she probably didn't need one, and then made it clear by his expression that this was her birthday and she was getting the second dessert. Sophie got the second dessert. She ate approximately 3 bites of it before announcing she was full. "Told you," she said. "I didn't say anything," Dylan said. "You were thinking it." "I was definitely thinking it." He looked across the table at Aurora, and for a moment, a specific, undefended moment, he was just a tired man who had been planning to do something nice for his daughter and had watched it go sideways and then hadn't, and was still processing the difference between those two things. "Thank you," he said. "For this. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Aurora said. And the odd thing was that it was completely true. The tow truck arrived at 9:47. They had been in the restaurant for nearly 2 hours, which Aurora had not fully tracked because time had done something unusual in the middle of it and simply moved without her noticing. She had talked to Dylan Mercer about bridges and capital and bad habits and what Sophie wanted to be when she grew up. The current answer was paleontologist, though she had also not ruled out working with animals or possibly being a chef, and she was keeping her options open. She had learned that Dylan's wife had left when Sophie was 3 years old. Not the whole story. He said it in the careful, edited way of someone who has learned to share the minimum version in casual contexts. But enough. He'd been doing this alone for 5 years. The ironed shirt and the good-dress birthday dinner, and the fact that he'd crouched beside a broken-down car for 20 minutes trying not to let his kids see him panicking, all made more sense with that context. Sophie had fallen asleep in her chair somewhere during the last half hour. Her cheek pressed against her own hand, the remains of 2 desserts in front of her, absolutely unconcerned with dignity. Dylan's phone buzzed. He checked it, stood up. "Toe's here." He looked down at Sophie, made a decision without apparent deliberation, just picked her up gently. She stirred slightly, didn't wake, resettled against his shoulder with the dead weight of a fully sleeping child. Her cat backpack dangled from one of his hands. He looked at Aurora. "I mean this," he said quietly. "Thank you. I don't—" She was really upset. About the car, she didn't say so, but— "I know," Aurora said. "I could tell." He nodded. "Yeah." There was a pause that wasn't awkward. Aurora noticed that, the absence of the usual friction that occupied silences between people who had just met and were trying to figure out what they were to each other. "Can I get your number?" he asked. "So I can, I don't know, do something in return. Dinner, maybe, once I find a restaurant that's actually open." Pescado was open, Sophie said, without opening her eyes. Dylan and Aurora both looked at her. "She's been awake this whole time," Dylan said. "I was resting," Sophie said. "There's a difference." He looked back at Aurora with an expression that was both apologetic and completely unsurprised. "As you can see." Aurora pulled a card from her bag. Not a business card. She had those, but they announced more than she wanted to announce tonight. Just a plain card with her personal number, the one that Nadine didn't screen and that only about 11 people in the world had. She handed it to Dylan. He looked at it, looked at her, put it in his pocket. "Happy birthday, Sophie," Aurora said. Sophie, still not opening her eyes, said, "It got better." Chat. Aurora stood on the sidewalk outside Maison Alara and watched Dylan carry his sleeping daughter to the tow truck. She watched him talk to the driver, settle Sophie carefully in the cab, go back for the cat backpack he'd left on the sidewalk. She watched him look back once, across the street, with the same slightly baffled expression he'd had when she first walked up to him, like he was still running a calculation and hadn't finished it yet. She took out her phone and called her driver. While she waited, she stood in the cool night air and thought about Marcus Webb walking out before dinner and how at the time it had felt like the worst thing that could have happened to her. She thought about the empty table and the untouched sea bass and the feeling of 40 people pretending not to watch. She thought about Sophie saying it got better. 8 years old, purple dress, cat backpack, 2 desserts, and the honest philosophical observation that a birthday that had been going badly had, in the end, become something else. Aurora Sterling had built an empire on knowing when the numbers changed, on reading a situation in real time and understanding when its value had shifted. She understood that tonight something had shifted. She didn't know what it meant yet. She was not for once 3 steps ahead with a mapped outcome and a prepared response. She was just standing on a sidewalk in her good dress, heels slightly wrong for cobblestones, watching a tow truck pull away and feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Curious. Not about what happened next with the business, not about tomorrow's calls or the quarter's numbers or what the board would say at Thursday's meeting. Just curious. About the man who thanked her like he meant it. About the little girl who had taken her measure in 30 seconds and then told her her nickname was a nickname, like that was useful information and she should know it. About what it would be like, she thought, to have dinner with them again. Her driver pulled up. She got in the car. The city moved past the windows in lights and shadows, and Aurora Sterling looked out at it with the particular expression of someone who has just realized the evening is going to be difficult to forget. Dylan didn't call for 4 days. Aurora noticed this in the way she noticed most things she didn't want to admit she was paying attention to, sideways, without looking directly at it. She went to work. She sat through a 7-hour board presentation about a potential acquisition in the Pacific Northwest. She had 3 separate arguments with her head of operations about a logistics contract that was bleeding money in ways nobody had adequately explained. She approved a capital expenditure, rejected 2 others, and ate lunch at her desk on all 4 days, which was normal, which was fine. She checked her personal phone more than usual. She didn't examine that too closely. On the 5th day, at 6:40 in the evening, while she was in the back of her car heading home from a dinner she'd left early because the conversation had been aggressively boring, her phone buzzed. "This is Dylan Mercer. Sophie wanted me to tell you she's been thinking about that chocolate thing. She said to say thank you again. She also said to tell you she looked up the restaurant and they have a different dessert every week, so she wanted to know if you knew that. I don't know why that's relevant information, but she insisted." Aurora read it twice. Then she typed back, "Tell her I didn't know that. She's done better research than most people I pay to do research." 3 minutes passed. She says you're welcome, and also that she told me so. Told you what? That you'd write back. Aurora looked at that message for a moment, then she typed, "Smart kid. She really is. Sometimes inconveniently so." She was still smiling at her phone when her driver pulled up to her building, and she had to make a deliberate effort to put it away before she got out of the car, which was not a thing she normally had to remind herself to do. The coffee happened because of a Saturday. Aurora worked most Saturdays, which was a fact she'd long since stopped apologizing for. Her assistant Nadine had once pointed out, gently and professionally, that Aurora worked most Saturdays the way some people breathed on most Saturdays. Not as a choice exactly, but as a baseline condition of existing. Aurora had said that was a dramatic way to put it. Nadine had said she was paid to be precise, not gentle. That particular Saturday, Aurora had finished her morning calls early and found herself with 2 hours she hadn't budgeted and no immediate use for them. She was standing in her kitchen with a cup of coffee she'd made herself, something she only did on weekends when Nadine wasn't there to manage her calendar and the cleaning service wasn't scheduled and the apartment had the particular quality of a space that belonged to her rather than a stage set for her life. And she was staring out the window at the park across the street when her phone buzzed again. "Sophie has a soccer game at Riverside at 10. You said you work too much. Come watch 8-year-olds be terrible at soccer if you need something to do that isn't work." She stared at the message. "That's a strange invitation," she typed back. "She asked me to invite you. I'm just the messenger." "Did she?" "She talked about you for 3 days." "I'm not exaggerating." Aurora looked at the park across the street. She looked at her empty calendar block. She thought about the board presentation she'd been planning to review for the 3rd time, which she didn't actually need to review a 3rd time, and she knew it. "Text me the address," she typed. Riverside Community Park was not Aurora's usual environment. That was the honest assessment. She had grown up in a house that had a yard but no neighborhood, and she had gone to schools that had athletic fields maintained by professional groundskeepers, and her adult life had produced very few occasions to stand on the sideline of an 8-year-old's recreational soccer game with a paper cup of coffee from a cart near the parking lot. She found Dylan near the halfway line, standing with his arms crossed and his jacket collar turned up against the wind that was coming off the river, watching the field with the focused attention of someone who had been to enough of these games to know which moments actually mattered. He spotted her before she reached him. Something in his expression did a small adjustment. Not surprise exactly. More like a person recalibrating a calculation they'd already half made. "You came," he said. Sophie asked. "Sophie asked through me. Then I came because Sophie asked through you." Aurora stopped beside him and looked at the field. "Which one is she?" "Number 7. Purple. Wait, they're all in the same jerseys." He pointed. "The one who's currently arguing with the referee." Aurora located the argument. Sophie Mercer, in a yellow jersey 2 sizes too large and with her hair escaping from a ponytail that had clearly been attempted and partially abandoned, was standing in front of a referee who was approximately 4 feet taller than her, explaining something with the focused intensity of a labor negotiator. "She gets that from somewhere," Aurora said. "Absolutely not from me," Dylan said. "The structural engineer who explained a bridge for 45 minutes. That was enthusiasm about infrastructure. This is Sophie being convinced the offsides rule is philosophically unsound." "Is she right?" He paused. "She has a point, but I can't tell her that." Aurora laughed, and beside her Dylan uncrossed his arms and put his hands in his pockets, and somehow without either of them noticing or announcing it, the space between them settled into something easy. Sophie's team lost 3-1. Sophie did not score, but she had an assist on the team's single goal, and afterwards she recounted the sequence of events leading up to it in complete and precise detail for anyone willing to listen. Dylan listened with the patience of someone who had been listening to Sophie's complete and precise details for 8 years and had developed genuine interest in them. Aurora listened because the story was actually good. Sophie had a sense of pacing and knew where to put the pause before the payoff. "And then I kicked it, and Maya kicked it, and it went in," Sophie concluded. "And I told Maya I knew it would work, and she said she didn't believe me at first, but she did now." "That's a good ending," Aurora said. "I practice endings," Sophie said seriously, "because Dad says the ending is what people remember." Dylan looked at Aurora over Sophie's head with the expression of a man whose words were being used as evidence against him for the second time in a week. They got sandwiches from a place 2 blocks from the park that Sophie declared the correct post-game tradition and that Dylan clearly agreed with based on the fact that he ordered without looking at the menu. They sat at a table outside even though it was cold enough that their breath showed, because Sophie wanted to watch the pigeons, which were doing something she found interesting and which Aurora could not identify as particularly interesting, but was willing to accept on Sophie's authority. It was the most uncomplicated 2 hours Aurora had spent in recent memory. That was the thing she kept bumping up against, the absence of calculation. Nobody at that table was trying to position themselves. Nobody was managing impressions or running a secondary agenda underneath the surface conversation. Dylan said what he thought. Sophie said everything she thought, completely, with no filtering system whatsoever, and Aurora found herself doing the same thing by a kind of contagion, saying things that were just true without first running them through the part of her brain that assessed how they'd land. At one point, she said that she didn't really have friends in the city, just people she knew through work, and the honesty of it surprised her more than it seemed to surprise either of them. Dylan just said, "Yeah, that happens." "Does it happen to you?" "More than I expected. When you're a single dad, you kind of drop out of the social rotation. People are nice about it, but the invitations slow down after a while because you always have to check the custody." He stopped. "I don't have a custody schedule, actually. She's just mine. But people assume you do, and then the invitations stop coming, and eventually you stop noticing that they stopped." Sophie had looked up from the pigeons during this. She looked at her father for a moment, then back at the pigeons, like she was giving him the privacy to say whatever he needed to say. 8 years old, and she already knew when to give someone space. Aurora didn't comment on that. She just stored it away in the part of her that was paying attention to who these people were. The weeks developed a rhythm without anyone deciding they would. That was the strange part. Nobody sat down and proposed a schedule. There was no conversation where Aurora and Dylan looked at each other and said, "We're doing this. We're including each other in our lives now. It just happened the way some things happen, incrementally, quietly, without a formal start date. She went to 2 more soccer games. She didn't go to the 4th one because she had a conflict she couldn't move, and Dylan texted her afterward with the score and Sophie's commentary, which ran to several messages and included a detailed critique of the opposing team's strategy. On a Thursday evening, she was near Dylan's neighborhood. She'd had a site visit for a development project 3 blocks over, and she texted to ask if they'd eaten. And 40 minutes later, she was sitting at Dylan's kitchen table while he made pasta that he described as nothing special. And Sophie set the table with the concentration of someone performing a ceremony. The pasta was genuinely good. The kitchen was small and slightly chaotic in the way of kitchens that are actually used. A stack of Sophie's drawings held to the refrigerator with magnets, a utility drawer that wouldn't quite close, a coffee maker that had seen better years and was still being asked for more. Aurora sat at that table and ate pasta that was nothing special and felt something she couldn't easily name. Not content. Content was too still for it. More like oriented. Like a compass needle that had been moving in small, restless circles, finally finding north. She didn't say that out loud. It would have been too much, but she thought it. Dylan, for his part, was careful. She noticed that too. He was warm and direct and funny in the dry, understated way that made her laugh because it was always true, but there was a boundary in him that he held consistently and without apology. He never touched her, not casually, not the arm during a conversation, not the shoulder when passing in a narrow kitchen, none of the small physical language that people use when they're interested and want to signal it. He was friendly in the way of someone who was genuinely friendly and also very deliberately keeping a door closed. She understood it. She respected it, actually. She knew about Sophie's mother only in outline. 3 years old when she'd left, no contact since, which Dylan had delivered in the flat tone of someone who had processed that particular grief a long time ago and came to it now with scar tissue rather than an open wound. She understood that a man raising a daughter alone for 5 years had reasons to be careful about what he let near her, about what he let near both of them. What she was less prepared for was how much Sophie was not careful at all. Sophie decided she liked Aurora with the immediate, uncomplicated certainty of a child who has not yet developed the social circuitry for doubt. Within 3 weeks, Sophie was texting Aurora directly. Dylan had apparently decided this was fine, or possibly Sophie had decided it was fine and Dylan had accepted the situation, with information that she deemed relevant and worth transmitting. A video of a dog that looked like a cloud. A question about what Aurora thought of a book Sophie was reading for school. A photo of a drawing Sophie had made of the 3 of them at the soccer game, executed in crayon with more enthusiasm than anatomical accuracy, which Aurora had looked at for a long moment and then saved to her phone. She didn't examine why she saved it. There was an evening in the 3rd week when Sophie had a school project that was due the following morning and had discovered this fact at 8:30 p.m., which Aurora knew about because Sophie had texted her a series of escalating messages over the course of 20 minutes. The project was a poster about a person who had changed the world through their work, and Sophie had originally chosen a paleontologist, but had now decided she wanted to do it about an engineer, specifically a woman engineer, and she needed help finding information. Aurora had called instead of texted. Sophie answered in the voice of someone operating at high capacity. "Did you see my messages?" "All 7 of them." "It's due tomorrow morning." "I know." "Okay, Sophie, what do you have so far?" "A blank poster board and some markers." "That's a start." "Where's your dad?" "He went to get more colored markers because I only have the dried out ones, and the project needs to look good. He'll be back in 20 minutes. I'm panicking a little." "I can tell. Stop panicking. You don't have time for it." Aurora had pulled up her laptop without really deciding to. "You said you want a woman engineer. Are you open to someone who did infrastructure?" "What's infrastructure?" "Things that hold civilization together. Roads, bridges, water systems. The stuff you don't notice until it's gone." Sophie was quiet for a second. "Like what my dad does?" "Exactly like what your dad does." "Okay," Sophie said. "Yeah. Tell me." So Aurora had walked her through it, Names, projects, the kind of specific details that made history feel like something that had actually happened to real people rather than a collection of approved facts. Sophie asked questions that were sharp and occasionally beside the point, but always genuinely curious. 40 minutes later, Dylan came back with markers to find his daughter on the phone, halfway through a poster, telling Aurora that she had decided the color scheme needed to be bold, not pretty, because bold said something. He'd stood in the kitchen doorway and listened for a moment. Then he'd come over, looked at the poster over Sophie's shoulder, and said quietly, not to Sophie, but across the room toward the phone propped against the juice glass, "Thank you." "She figured most of it out herself," Aurora said. "That's not why I'm saying thank you." Sophie looked up at him, and then at the phone, and seemed to decide that whatever was happening between the adults was something she didn't need to comment on, which meant she'd noticed it, which meant Aurora had been right about her. The thing about a secret is that it only feels like one when it's about to become relevant. Aurora had not, technically, lied to Dylan. She had said finance, capital allocation, building things. All of that was true. She had not said I manage a portfolio worth $4.2 billion, and my face has appeared on the cover of 3 national publications, and my company employs over 1,200 people. Those were omissions, not lies, and she told herself that distinction mattered, but the longer she spent with Dylan and Sophie, the heavier the omission got. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was more like the discomfort of wearing a coat that fit differently than it used to. She could still move in it, but she was aware of it in a way she hadn't been at the beginning. The problem was that she knew what happened when people found out. She'd watched it enough times to have it memorized. There was always a moment of recalibration, a small but perceptible shift in how they held themselves around her, in what they said and how they said it. The questions changed. The silences changed. Something that had been easy became slightly deliberate, slightly performed, and no amount of sincerity on either side could fully undo it. With Dylan, she didn't want that. She was aware of how much she didn't want it. She told herself it would come up naturally, that there would be a moment that felt right, that she wasn't hiding anything, she was just waiting for the right context. She told herself a lot of things. 4 weeks in, on a Sunday afternoon, Sophie asked Aurora what her apartment looked like. They were at the park, not Riverside this time, a smaller park near Sophie's school that Sophie had strong opinions about and had been lobbying to visit. Dylan was on the phone 15 feet away, dealing with something work-related with the distracted, slightly tense focus of someone who had been hoping the call wouldn't come through on a Sunday and had been wrong. "Big," Aurora said. It was true. The apartment was large in the way that things purchased primarily for symbolic value rather than practical use tend to be. "How big?" "Too big." Sophie considered this. "Bigger than our apartment?" "Yes." "Do you live alone?" "Yes." Sophie pulled at a thread on the cuff of her jacket, which was a habit Aurora had come to recognize as Sophie's version of thinking. "Doesn't it feel weird, being in a big place alone?" Aurora looked at her. "Sometimes." "We have a pretty small apartment," Sophie said, "but there's always something happening. Dad makes breakfast really loud. He doesn't notice he's doing it, but he is." A pause. "Sometimes I think if it was quiet, I wouldn't know what to do with myself." "I think that's true for most people," Aurora said. "Do you like quiet?" Aurora thought about her apartment on weekday evenings. The specific quality of the silence in it. Not peaceful exactly, more like the silence of a room waiting for something. "I used to," she said. "I'm less sure now." Sophie seemed to file this somewhere. She had a system for information about people that she didn't announce but clearly maintained. Dylan came back over, putting his phone in his pocket with the expression of someone who had just dealt with a medium-sized fire and was trying to look like he hadn't. "Sorry, work thing." "It's Sunday," Sophie said. "Bridges don't know what day it is." "That's not a real thing. That's just a thing you say." "It's both," Dylan said, and dropped down onto the bench beside Aurora with the comfortable exhaustion of someone who had stopped pretending the week hadn't been long. He was close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and he didn't move away, and neither did she, and Sophie was already off the bench and heading toward the climbing structure and not looking at either of them in a way that suggested she was paying a great deal of attention. They sat for a few minutes without talking. The park had that late afternoon quality, light going amber at the edges, the temperature dropping, a couple of other families packing up to go home. Dylan watched Sophie climb with one part of his attention and let the rest of it go somewhere else. "She asked me last week," he said, "if you were going to keep coming around." Aurora looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know, that it was up to you." He paused. "She said that wasn't a real answer." "She's right." "I know she's right." He turned his water bottle in his hands. "I just didn't want to say something I couldn't back up." Aurora kept her eyes on Sophie at the top of the climbing structure, surveying the park below with the authority of someone who had conquered something. "What would you have backed up?" Dylan was quiet for a moment. "I'd have told her you'd probably keep coming around," he said, "because you seem like you want to." Aurora said nothing. "I just wanted you to know," he said, "that she's noticed, that it means something to her." He stopped. "I noticed too. That's all I'm saying." It was not a declaration. It was not close to a declaration. It was a careful, measured acknowledgement from a careful, measured man who had a daughter to protect and 5 years of doing everything alone and very specific reasons to move slowly. Aurora understood every one of those reasons. She also understood that she was sitting in a park on a Sunday afternoon next to a man who made pasta and attended infrastructure meetings and told his daughter that manners were for everyone or no one, and that she had not felt this particular kind of comfortable in so long that she'd almost forgotten what it was called. "I want to keep coming around," she said. Simple. True. Dylan nodded, just once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already half known. Sophie descended the climbing structure and came back across the grass at a run, cheeks red from the cold, and dropped between them on the bench with the easy confidence of someone who considered both sides of this equation already settled. "Can we get hot chocolate?" she said. "There's hot chocolate at home," Dylan said. "The kind from the place counts more." "Why does it count more?" "Because we went outside and did something. You have to mark occasions." Dylan looked at Aurora. Aurora looked at Dylan. "She's not wrong," Aurora said. "She's never wrong," Dylan said, with the mild despair of a parent who has accepted this fact. "That's the problem." They got hot chocolate from the cart near the park entrance, and Sophie walked between them on the way back to the car, telling them about something that had happened at school involving a science experiment and a very unfortunate outcome that she seemed to find considerably funnier than her teacher had. Aurora listened, and Dylan listened, and the streetlights were just beginning to come on above them. It was ordinary. That was the word for it. Completely, unremarkably ordinary, in the way of things that are easy because they're real, not constructed, not managed, not engineered for a particular outcome. Just 3 people walking on a sidewalk in the early evening, and one of them laughing about a science experiment, and the hot chocolate getting cold because nobody was drinking it fast enough. Aurora held the cup with both hands and thought about her empty apartment and the silence in it, and what Sophie had said about always having something happening, about not knowing what to do with quiet. She thought about how 4 weeks ago she had been sitting alone at the best table in a restaurant, watching a man walk away before he'd even tried. She thought, this is the thing you can't manufacture. This is the thing you either find or you don't. She didn't say any of that out loud. She just walked and listened to Sophie's story and let the evening be what it was. The call came at 7:14 on a Wednesday evening. Aurora was in a meeting that had already run 40 minutes over schedule. A budget review that had turned into a philosophical debate about risk tolerance, the kind of meeting that starts with numbers and ends with people defending their personalities. She had her phone face down on the table the way she always did in meetings, which meant she felt the buzz but didn't see it. Then it buzzed again. Then a third time in quick succession, and something in the pattern of it, the urgency of 3 calls inside 90 seconds, made her pick it up before she'd consciously decided to. Dylan's name on the screen. 3 missed calls. She was out of her chair before she'd told herself to stand up. She stepped into the hallway and called back, and he picked up on the first ring, and the sound of his voice told her everything before the words did. It was the voice of a person who was keeping themselves functional through sheer mechanical effort, every word deliberate, every sentence a small act of controlled breathing. Sophie was at the school showcase, he said. The science fair, the one she's been. I was running late from a site. I was 20 minutes away. She texted me she'd wait by the front entrance. A pause. Just a breath. She's not there. Nobody's seen her leave. I've been through the whole building twice. Aurora. She's not here. The hallway was empty. Fluorescent lights, gray carpet, the muffled sound of her meeting continuing behind a closed door. How long? Aurora said. 40 minutes since her last text. I've called her teacher, the front office, 3 of the other parents. Nobody saw her go. There was a black SUV parked on the side street. One of the other parents mentioned it, said it'd been there for a while. It's gone now. Aurora's brain went to a very cold, very specific place. She knew what a black SUV parked outside a school event could mean. She knew it in the precise, detailed way of someone who had spent 3 years building a private security infrastructure after her company's first major acquisition had come with threats attached, and who had consequently learned more than she'd wanted to about how people used leverage. Dylan, she said, listen to me. Call the police right now. Don't wait. I'm going to make some calls of my own, and I'm going to come to you. Text me the school address. What kind of calls? His voice shifted, not accusatory yet, just tracking the precision in her voice, the way she'd said my own like she had a different category of resource available. Rory, what? Trust me right now, she said. Please. Call the police and text me the address and I will explain everything. But Sophie is more important than the explanation. 3 seconds of silence. Okay, he said. She was already walking toward the elevator, her jacket in one hand, her phone in the other, pulling up a number she had not called in 4 months and hoping Marcus Vale, who ran her private security operations and had once told her he could find anyone in any city within 6 hours given the right inputs, was going to pick up on the first ring. He did. The school was 22 minutes away. Aurora's driver made it in 16. Dylan was outside the front entrance when she arrived, standing under the lights with 2 police officers and a school administrator who looked like she was holding herself together through institutional habit. He turned when he heard the car door, and the look on his face when he saw her, relief and something under the relief that she didn't have time to examine, nearly stopped her mid-step. She kept moving. The police took a report, he said as she reached him. They're treating it as a possible abduction. There's a unit checking the surrounding area. He was reading her face as he spoke, the way she'd noticed he always did, not searching for comfort, searching for information. You said you'd explain. I will, she said. Are you okay? No. Good. Don't try to be. She turned to the officer nearest to her. I have a private security and investigation firm already running a search. My lead investigator is pulling traffic camera footage for a 4-block radius as of right now. I'll share everything we pull with your department in real time. The officer looked at her, then at Dylan, then back at her with the particular expression of law enforcement encountering civilian resources that are better than their own and deciding how to feel about it. Who are you? Someone who can help find her faster, Aurora said. I'd rather spend the next 20 minutes doing that than explaining credentials. Dylan said quietly from behind her, let her work. What? Marcus Vale arrived 40 minutes later with a team of 3 and a mobile setup that fit into 2 hard cases. He was 51 years old, former Federal Investigative Division, with a manner that was so flat and practical it had the effect of making panic feel structurally unsound. He shook Aurora's hand and looked at Dylan and said, Tell me everything you know about the vehicle. Dylan told him. Black SUV, newer model, tinted windows, parked on the East Side Street. The parent who'd noticed it had seen it there for at least an hour before the showcase ended. Plates obscured or removed, unclear which. The other parent, Marcus said, Can you get me their number in the next 5 minutes? Yes? Do that. Dylan stepped away with his phone. Marcus turned to Aurora and lowered his voice by 1 register. I've already pulled the relevant footage. There's a gap. Camera on the East Side Street had a malfunction window of about 22 minutes. That's not a coincidence. Someone planned it, Aurora said. Someone planned it, Marcus confirmed. Which means they knew about the event schedule, they knew which entrance, and they had the technical capability to interfere with a city traffic camera. He paused. Aurora, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Yes. Is there anyone in your current business landscape, deals pending, disputes ongoing, anything that's gotten heated in the last 6 months, who would use a child? The word landed in her chest like something cold. She thought about it. She thought about it seriously, going through the inventory with the systematic efficiency that Marcus had trained her to use in these situations, and she arrived at the same place she'd been quietly circling since Dylan's voice on the phone told her what had happened. Harlan Voss, she said. Marcus's expression didn't change, but she felt the attention behind it sharpen. The Voss Group. We've been in dispute over a contested acquisition for 4 months. It went to arbitration 6 weeks ago, and it's not going his way. She stopped. He's not someone who accepts losing. Has he made threats? Not direct ones. His lawyers communicate in a way that's designed to feel threatening without technically being threatening. I have a file. Send it to me now. She was already on her phone. Marcus, they took the wrong child. Whoever did this, if this is Voss, they thought they were taking my daughter. They didn't know I don't have one. The silence that followed that sentence was extremely specific. Marcus looked at her for 2 seconds. How long have you been part of this family's life? About 6 weeks. Does the father know who you are? There it was. The sentence she'd been avoiding for 6 weeks, arriving in a parking lot outside an elementary school at 8:30 on a Wednesday night. No, she said. Marcus said nothing. That was its own kind of response. I know, Aurora said. I'm not judging, he said. I'm assessing. If Voss's people did surveillance on you and connected you to this family, they would have watched the dynamic long enough to make an assumption about the relationship. To them, Sophie is probably collateral, Aurora said. The word tasted wrong in her mouth. Yes, that's what I'm afraid of. Dylan came back across the parking lot. He'd gotten the parents' contact information, delivered it to Marcus's associate, and was now looking between the two of them with the focused, controlled intensity of a man who understood that he was operating in a situation where other people had information he didn't, and was deciding how to handle that. What aren't you telling me? He said. It was not phrased as a question. Dylan, what aren't you telling me? Still not a question. Quieter this time, which was worse. Aurora looked at him. She made a decision she'd been avoiding for 6 weeks and said, My full name is Aurora Sterling. I'm the CEO and majority shareholder of Sterling Capital Group. My company is currently in an acquisition dispute with a man named Harlan Voss, and I believe Sophie may have been taken because someone watching me assumed she was my daughter. I'm sorry. I should have told you who I was. That's on me, and I'll explain everything, but right now we need to find Sophie. Dylan stood very still. In the parking lot lights, his face went through several things, none of them small. She watched the information land and reorganize and settle into something she couldn't quite read. Not yet. Not in the middle of all of this. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the thing she'd noticed they did when he was thinking hard and fast and didn't want to show it. Harlan Voss, he said. Yes. You know this. I believe it. We don't have confirmation yet. But your people are working on it. Yes. Another silence. Then Dylan turned to Marcus. What do you need from me? The next several hours existed in that particular altered state that crises produce, time moving in uneven increments, some minutes feeling like 10, and some hours collapsing into what felt like moments. Marcus and his team worked with the quiet precision of people who had done this before, and the police worked alongside them with less initial enthusiasm and more as the night went on and it became clear that Marcus's operation was producing information faster than their own. Aurora stayed. She hadn't been invited to stay and nobody had asked her to leave, and the decision seemed to have been made by the situation itself rather than by anyone in it. At 11 p.m., Marcus's team confirmed the vehicle. Footage from a private security camera on a building 4 blocks east had caught the plate. A rental, false registration, but the rental agency had a physical location and a camera in the parking lot, and by 11:20 they had a face. At 11:45, a contact Marcus wouldn't name but clearly trusted confirmed that the face belonged to a man currently contracted through a shell company with documented ties to Voss Group's private security subsidiary. Aurora was on the phone with her lawyer within 3 minutes. Her lawyer was on the phone with 2 additional parties within 5. The kind of machinery that money makes available when it's deployed without hesitation. It moved fast, and it moved hard, and it had no interest in being subtle about any of it. Dylan sat on the steps at the front entrance of the school. He'd been sitting there for 20 minutes. He'd called his mother, who was coming to be with him. He'd called Sophie's school emergency contact. He'd done everything that needed to be done, and now he was just sitting, and Aurora sat down beside him because she didn't know what else to do, and doing nothing felt unbearable. "You have lawyers making calls right now," he said. "Yes, and investigators, and what was it? A private security firm." "Yes." He turned his water bottle in his hands. The same habit she'd noticed in the restaurant on the night they'd met. The turning, the steadying. "How long have you known who I was?" The question surprised her. "What?" "That first night, when you came across the street. Did you know who I was?" "No. I saw a broken-down car and a little girl in a birthday dress." He was quiet. "So it was real?" "Yes," she said. "It was completely real." He didn't say anything to that. He went back to turning the bottle. "I wanted to tell you," she said. There was never a time that felt right, and then it had been too long, and the moment had passed, and I told myself it didn't change anything because it shouldn't change anything." She paused. "But that's not why I didn't tell you. I didn't tell you because I liked who I was around you. I liked being just Rory, and I didn't want to lose that." Whoops. Dylan looked at the parking lot. "That's honest," he said finally. "Yes. I'm still angry." "I know." "Not right now. I can't be angry right now." His voice was flat and careful, the structure of a man holding an enormous amount of weight in a very small container. "Right now, I just need my daughter back." "We're going to get her back," Aurora said. "You don't know that. I know the people who are looking for her and what they're capable of. I know that Voss wants leverage, not harm. He wants to use her, which means—" She stopped. She hated saying it. "Which means she's safe as long as she's useful to him. And she stops being useful to him the moment he understands what it's going to cost him to keep her." Dylan looked at her for a long moment. "What's it going to cost him?" he said. "Everything," Aurora said. "I'll take his company apart board member by board member if that's what it takes." Something in Dylan's face shifted. Not softened. He was too far inside the fear for anything to soften. But something. Like a person hearing a voice in the dark and understanding they're not alone in it. He didn't say anything. He turned the water bottle one more time and then set it down, and they sat on the steps of the school together and waited. At 2:17 in the morning, Marcus got a location. He came across the parking lot at a pace that wasn't quite running but covered ground fast, and Aurora was on her feet before he reached her. Dylan was beside her in the same motion. "Storage facility about 12 miles east. Private unit, registered to the same shell company. We have eyes on an SUV matching the description parked outside." Marcus was already pulling out his phone. "Police are being notified simultaneously. They'll have units there in 8 minutes." Dylan was moving toward his car before Marcus had finished the sentence. "Dylan," Aurora said, "I'm going." "I know. I'm coming with you." He looked at her across the car roof, and there was a full conversation in that look. The anger that was still there, banked but present, and underneath it something raw that neither of them was in a position to name right now. He gave a short nod. They drove. Dechet. The storage facility was a low concrete building surrounded by chain link on 3 sides. Industrial, featureless. The kind of place designed to hold things without drawing attention to them. There were 2 police units already in the lot when they arrived, blue and red lights cutting across the concrete walls without sirens. Marcus's car pulled in behind them. Aurora and Dylan were told to stay back. Dylan stayed back for approximately 90 seconds. Aurora put her hand on his arm, not to stop him, just to be there, and he stood absolutely still with every muscle in his body pointed toward that building, his breath coming in controlled measures, watching the officers move toward the unit at the far end of the structure. The door opened. They heard Sophie before they saw her. Not crying. That was the first thing. A voice coming from inside the unit, high and clear and distinctly Sophie, saying, "I already told you my dad is going to be really upset and you should think about that." And then an officer's voice, low and reassuring, and then Sophie again, louder, "Is my dad here?" Dylan made a sound that Aurora would never fully describe. It wasn't words. It was the sound of 5 years of holding everything together, finding one small fracture and letting something through. He was already moving. He crossed the distance at a speed that Aurora hadn't known he had in him, and Sophie came through the door of the storage unit with an officer on one side and a thermal blanket around her shoulders that she was wearing with the mild irritation of someone who had accepted it under protest. She was still in her science fair clothes. She had a small scrape on her knee. She looked, overall, like someone who had been frightened and had decided not to show it, and then had decided to compensate by telling her captors what she thought of them. Dylan reached her and went to his knees on the concrete, and she came into his arms, and he held her in the specific way of a person reclaiming something they thought they'd lost. Both arms around her, face pressed to the top of her head, not saying anything. Sophie's arms went around his neck. "I knew you'd come," she said, into his shoulder. "I know," he said. His voice was barely there. "I know you did." Aurora stood 20 feet away and watched this with something in her chest that had no clean name. Relief, yes, enormous and almost dizzy, but also something adjacent to grief. The grief of someone watching a moment that is complete and perfect and entirely someone else's. She turned away to give them the space of it. Marcus appeared at her elbow. "She's physically fine, shaken, dehydrated, but unharmed." The two men with her were, he paused, choosing a word, professionals. This was always about leverage, not harm. "Voss," Aurora said, "his legal team will know about the evidence we have before sunrise. I suspect your lawyer will be receiving calls." "Tell her to let them wait," Aurora said. "Let them wait until morning." Marcus nodded and stepped away. Aurora stood alone at the edge of the parking lot. The lights from the police units were still moving across the walls. She could hear Sophie's voice again. She was telling the officer something, with the gathering energy of a child who had been storing up things to say. And she could hear Dylan's voice, low and close, not words, just the texture of someone staying near. She thought about Harlan Voss. She thought about what the next 72 hours would look like. The lawyers, the evidence, the kind of sustained institutional pressure that her resources made possible and that he would not have adequately prepared for because he had underestimated her, which people who looked at the number on her net worth and thought they understood what she was made of always did. She thought about the weight she'd been carrying for 6 weeks, the omission that had grown into something heavier than she'd intended. She thought about Dylan's face in the parking lot when she'd said her full name, the way he'd gone still. She'd known, even then, that there was a conversation coming that wasn't going to be clean, that the thing she'd been afraid of losing might be in the process of being lost anyway, not because she'd built it on a lie, but because the truth of who she was had reached them anyway. Not through her own choice, not in a moment she'd controlled, but through a storage unit and a child with a thermal blanket and 2 men who had taken the wrong girl. The worst version of the reveal. Sophie's voice floated across the parking lot. "Aurora, you're here!" Aurora turned around. Sophie had spotted her from 20 feet away, Dylan still crouched beside her, and was looking at Aurora with an expression of pure, uncomplicated relief. Not surprise that she was there, just relief, the same relief she'd given her father. Like Aurora's presence at the edge of a parking lot at 2:30 in the morning was something that made sense, something that fit, something Sophie had somewhere in the back of her 8-year-old brain filed under people who show up. Aurora walked over. Sophie opened the thermal blanket and grabbed Aurora's hand with both of hers, the way she did when she was establishing proximity, not asking permission, just deciding. "I told them you'd be here," she said. "I was here," Aurora said. "I know." She looked up at Aurora, then at her father, with the alert, evaluating look she got sometimes, the look that understood more than she said. "Are you guys okay?" Dylan and Aurora looked at each other across the top of Sophie's head. His face was exhausted and scraped open and completely unguarded in the way of people who have gone past the point where managing expressions feels worth the effort. He was angry with her. That was still there. She could see it. And he was also looking at her with the specific expression of someone who had just watched her spend 5 hours using every resource she had to bring his daughter home. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. Sophie looked between them and seemed to make her own assessment of the situation. "You should probably talk," she said. "Later. Not now, but later." Dylan made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. "Yeah," he said roughly. "Yeah, we probably should." He put his arm around Sophie and looked at Aurora one more time. Not a resolution, not a forgiveness, just an acknowledgement. That she was standing here, that she had been here all night, that whatever happened next, tonight had been real, and both of them knew it. The police lights kept moving across the concrete walls. Somewhere nearby, a car started. Marcus was on the phone, already building the architecture of what came next. The night was at that thin, exhausted edge just before it starts becoming morning. Sophie leaned against her father's side and kept hold of Aurora's hand and refused to let go of either of them. And for a few minutes, they just stood there in the parking lot while the world around them did what it needed to do. The conversation happened 3 days later. Not the next morning. The next morning, Sophie slept until 10, and Dylan sat in the kitchen drinking coffee. And Aurora's lawyer spent 4 hours on the phone dismantling the legal architecture that Harlan Voss had spent months constructing. There were statements to give to police, and documents to sign, and Marcus Vail to debrief, and approximately 47 things that needed to happen before any of the human ones could. Aurora handled them. That was what she did. She handled things, systematically, in order of urgency, with the focused efficiency that had built her company from a 3-person operation in a rented office into the thing it was now. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The difference was that this time, somewhere underneath the machinery of it, she was aware of a quiet dread that had nothing to do with Harlan Voss. Sophie was safe. The legal case against Voss was airtight and getting tighter. Marcus had confirmed that the 2 men from the storage unit were cooperating with police in ways that would be extremely consequential for their employer. All of that was moving in the right direction. But Dylan had not called. He'd texted once, the morning after, to say Sophie was home and rested and asking for pancakes. That was all. Short, factual, the text of a man who was handling one thing at a time and had put her in a specific category marked "not yet." Aurora understood that. She gave him the space of it. She sent back a single line. "Glad she's okay. Take whatever time you need." And then she went back to work and tried not to check her phone more than once an hour, and mostly failed. On the 3rd day at 6 in the evening, he called. "Sophie's at my mother's tonight," he said when she picked up. "Can you come over?" Dylan's apartment looked different at night without Sophie in it. Quieter in a way that wasn't just the absence of sound, more like the absence of a particular kind of energy that Sophie generated without effort, that thing she had where any room she occupied felt inhabited in a specific, warm, slightly chaotic way. Without it, the apartment was just small and functional and honest about what it was, a place a man had built around the edges of raising a child alone. Dylan was at the kitchen counter when she arrived. He'd made coffee he wasn't drinking, which was a habit she'd come to recognize in him. The making of something as an excuse for something to do with his hands. He turned when she came in and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her in the parking lot, that unguarded, stripped-back look. No performance in it, just Dylan Mercer deciding what to say and making himself say it. "Sit down," he said. She sat at the kitchen table. He stayed at the counter. "I've been thinking about this for 3 days," he said, "about what I want to say and how I want to say it, and whether I'm being fair." He paused. "I'm probably not entirely fair. I want to be upfront about that." "Okay," Aurora said. "I'm angry," he said. "I want to start there, because if I don't say it first, it'll come out sideways, and that's worse." He picked up his coffee, set it back down. "You sat in this kitchen and ate pasta and came to Sophie's soccer games and let my daughter text you about dogs and school projects, and you knew the whole time that there was a version of yourself you were keeping back. And I get it. I understand the reasons you gave, and I think most of them were true, but I want you to understand what it felt like from where I was standing." Aurora said nothing. She'd decided before she came that she would let him finish. I don't have a lot of... He stopped, started again. I'm careful about what I let near Sophie, about what I let near both of us. After Claire left, I made a decision that I wasn't going to bring people into our life casually. That if someone was going to be around her, around us, they were going to be real. All the way real, not a version of themselves they'd decided was safe to show us. He met her eyes. And I let you in. I made that choice consciously because you felt real to me. Because the way you were with her felt real. And it was real. I still believe that. But there was this whole other dimension of who you are that you kept in a separate room, and I didn't get to make an informed decision about that. You're right, Aurora said. He looked at her like he'd been expecting an argument, and the absence of one had shifted something. Yeah? Yes. I made a choice that should have been yours to make. Whether to have someone in your lives whose world comes with that kind of risk, that was your call, not mine. I took it away from you because I was protecting something for myself. That's true, and I'm not going to qualify it. Dylan was quiet for a moment. What were you protecting? He asked. It was the question she'd known was coming, and the one she'd spent 3 days finding the honest answer to. The way you saw me, she said. When I met you, that night with the car, at the restaurant, you didn't know anything about me. You weren't impressed, and you weren't intimidated, and you weren't calculating how useful I might be. You were just talking to me, like a regular person. She looked at the table. I've been Aurora Sterling since I was 23 years old. That's almost 8 years of people deciding who I am before I finish a sentence. And with you, it was different. I wanted to keep it different. I knew it was selfish. Dylan turned his coffee cup on the counter. The man at the restaurant, the one who walked out, he made assumptions about you because of the money. Yes. And you thought I'd do the same thing. I thought something would change, she said. I didn't know exactly what. I just knew something would. Dylan looked at her for a long moment. Something did change, he said, when you told me. In the parking lot. His jaw was tight again. But not for the reasons you were afraid of. I know, she said quietly. I know it changed because Sophie got hurt because of me. Because of who I am and the people who want to use what I have against me. That's part of it. What's the other part? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. He moved from the counter finally and came to sit at the table, not across from her at the corner, closer than he usually positioned himself. She noticed that. The other part, he said, is that I've been sitting here for 3 days trying to figure out whether I was angry because you hid it or because of what you hid. Because there's a difference. What do you mean? If you told me on that first night, I'm a billionaire, I run a company, this is what my life looks like, I don't know if we'd have gotten here. I don't know if I'd have let you keep coming around. Not because of who you are, but because of the automatic... He looked for the word. Distance. The distance I would have kept. Because I would have told myself it didn't make sense. That our lives were too different. That it was a bad idea to let Sophie get attached to someone whose world is... He gestured. The gesture meant that. All of that. So you're angry that you didn't get to make that decision, she said, and you're also saying you might have made the wrong one. I'm saying I'm glad I didn't make it, and I'm also angry you took it from me, and those two things are both true at the same time, and I'm not done figuring out what to do with that. Aurora looked at him. The kitchen light was the same as always, slightly warm, slightly tired, the overhead light of a room that had seen a lot of ordinary evenings. Dylan Mercer at his own kitchen table, still in work clothes because he'd come straight home and then not bothered to change, hair the way it always was, face doing that thing it did when he was thinking hard and letting her see it. I should have told you sooner, she said. There's no version where that's not true, and I can't go back and change what happened to Sophie. I will spend however long it takes making sure Voss can't come near your family again, and that is not a negotiation, that's just what's going to happen. But I can't undo those 6 weeks, and I'm not sure I'd want to, even though they ended like this. And I understand if that's not something you can... Stop, he said. She stopped. I'm not ending this, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm angry, he said. I'm going to be angry for a while, and I'd like you to let me be, without trying to manage it or fix it. Can you do that? Yes. I'm also... He rubbed his face with one hand in the way he did when he was tired and done performing composure. Sophie asked about you 4 times yesterday, 4 times in one day. Did Aurora call? When is Aurora coming over? Does Aurora know I'm okay? He shook his head. She's 8. She doesn't have my complicated feelings about this. She just knows she missed you. Aurora's throat tightened in a way she hadn't prepared for. I missed her too, she said. I know you did. He dropped his hand from his face. That's actually the part that made me the most angry, if I'm honest, because I could see it was real, all of it. And being angry at something real is harder than being angry at something fake. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere on the street, a car went past. The refrigerator made its usual sound. I have a question, Aurora said. Okay. The bridge. The one you drove Sophie to see. The one you talked about for 45 minutes. He looked at her sideways. What about it? Was it really a good bridge? Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. The involuntary kind that comes before a person decides to let it through. One of the best I've ever worked on, he said. Suspension, modified cable configuration, the load distribution on the central span was... Tell me about it, she said. He looked at her. I mean it, she said. Tell me about the bridge. He talked about the bridge for 30 minutes, not because she'd asked out of pity or politeness, and he knew the difference. She asked questions, actual questions, the kind that required him to go deeper rather than summarize, about the cable tensions and the soil composition at the anchor points, and what happened to the calculations when they discovered the bedrock survey had been done wrong and they were 6 weeks into the build. He talked with his hands. She'd never seen him do that before. He was usually economical with movement, contained. But when he talked about infrastructure, he used his whole body to show her forces and angles and the places where things wanted to fail and didn't. She watched him and thought about how the most honest version of a person is the one that comes out when they're talking about the thing they actually care about, the thing they'd explain to anyone who'd listen, and thought that this, right here, in this small kitchen, with the coffee going cold and the overhead light, and Dylan Mercer explaining why a particular cable configuration had solved a problem no one thought was solvable, was maybe the most real she'd ever felt near another person. He stopped himself eventually, looked at her with a slightly embarrassed awareness of how much time had passed. Sophie's right, she said. It's not kind of cool, it's very cool. He shook his head, but the smile was fully there now, tired and real, and it changed the room the way it always did. You're the first person outside of work who's ever actually wanted to know, he said. I find that hard to believe. My mother's eyes glaze over at suspension. My friends redirect to sports. He paused. Claire used to say I loved the bridges more than I loved her. She wasn't entirely wrong about the proportion of time I spent thinking about them. Aurora looked at him. He didn't say Claire's name often. In 6 weeks, she could count the times on one hand. Do you miss it? She said. Having someone to talk to about all of it. Yeah, he said simply. Not dramatically, not with weight, just true, the way Dylan said most things. I got good at not missing it, but yeah. They were quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the beginning of the evening. Something had shifted in the room, the way the temperature shifts after a storm has fully passed. I want to tell you something, Aurora said. Dylan looked at her. I have spent 8 years, since the company started making real money, not being able to trust that anything was actually about me. Relationships, friendships, even professional alliances. There's always the calculation running underneath. What they want from my position, or my access, or my capital, and I got so used to it that I stopped expecting anything different. She kept her eyes on the table. And then I walked across a street in good shoes that were wrong for cobblestones, and I met a man who asked me straight out whether my date left because he was an idiot or because I'd done something, and I thought, this one is different. This one says what he thinks. Dylan was listening. I handled it badly, she said. The secrecy. I should have trusted you sooner, and I didn't, and that's mine to carry. But I want you to know that those 6 weeks were real. Everything I said, everything I felt in that kitchen and at those soccer games and sitting on the bench at the park, that was me. Just me. Not Aurora Sterling with an agenda. Dylan was quiet for a long moment. I know that, he said. I know you know, she said. I just wanted to say it directly. He turned his coffee cup one more time and then pushed it aside and looked at her. There's going to be stuff, he said. Security concerns, people with cameras, whatever this Voss situation finishes as. Sophie is going to have to know more about the risk than I ever wanted her to know about at 8 years old. He wasn't accusing, just naming it, building the real picture of what this was. My life is not built for that. I'm an engineer. I drive Sophie to soccer on Saturdays. I make pasta that's not that impressive. That's what I've got. I know. And I need you to not try to fix things with money, he said. Not because I think you're trying to buy anything, but because Sophie needs to know that what's between us is between us, not between my bank account and yours. You understand what I'm saying? Yes, she said. Good. He looked at her directly. I also need you to tell me when something is going on, in your world. If there's a risk I don't know about, I need to know, even if you're afraid of how I'll react. I'll tell you. Everything. Everything, she confirmed. Dylan nodded. A long exhale, the kind that's been held for days. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. He stood up and picked up both coffee cups, cold, both of them barely touched, and poured them out in the sink and rinsed the cups without ceremony. She watched him do it and thought about how that gesture, standing at a sink rinsing cups at the end of a hard conversation, was one of the most human things she'd ever seen someone do. Just the ordinary continuation of a day. Everything that had just been said acknowledged and set down and life resuming around it. He came back to the table, sat down in a different chair this time, directly across from her. Sophie wants you at her school assembly next week, he said. She hasn't asked me yet, but she will. I know the warning signs. The thread pulling on the jacket cuff, Aurora said. Exactly. That's the tell. He paused. I'm telling you in advance so you have time to actually check your calendar and not just say yes and then have to cancel. She notices when people cancel. I'll check my calendar tonight, Aurora said. I'll move things if I need to. Dylan looked at her for a moment with that steady, assessing look. She's going to know, eventually, what happened, he said quietly. The full version. Not now, but whenever you think she's ready, Aurora said. And I'll be there when you tell her, if that's what you want. He thought about it. Yeah, he said. I think that's what I want. Outside the window, the city did what it always did, indifferent to the size or smallness of any given conversation happening within it. Dylan's apartment, with its cluttered refrigerator and its slightly sticky utility drawer, was the same as it had always been, but something inside it had been rearranged. Not fixed, not resolved the way clean endings are resolved, but rearranged into something more honest than it had been before. Aurora Sterling, full name, all of it, sitting across from a man who had decided, not easily, not without cost, that the real version was the one worth keeping. Dylan stretched his arms behind his head the way he did when the tension was going out of him, and looked at the ceiling for a second. You want coffee? He said. Actual coffee. I'll make it right this time. Yes, she said. Please. He got up and started over with the coffee maker, and Aurora sat at the kitchen table in the small, warm light, and the drawer that wouldn't close was still not closing, and somewhere on the refrigerator Sophie's drawings were still held up with magnets, and none of it was perfect, and all of it was exactly where she wanted to be. 2 weeks later, Aurora was in a negotiation meeting when her phone buzzed. She had it face down, the way she always did. She left it. The meeting ran 20 minutes, then adjourned, and when she turned the phone over, there was a photo from Sophie. Taken with Dylan's phone, she could tell from the angle, which was always slightly too high when Sophie used it, of a drawing Sophie had made. Third-person perspective this time. 3 stick figures at a table that Aurora recognized as the kitchen table. Each figure was labeled in Sophie's handwriting, careful letters she'd clearly been working on. Dad, Aurora, me. Below the drawing, in Sophie's handwriting, she had added a caption. I made us a family portrait. Dad said I should ask first, but I already did it so. Aurora sat alone in her conference room for 30 seconds, looking at a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures at a kitchen table. Then she typed back, It's perfect. I'm framing it. 3 minutes later, Sophie. I told Dad you'd say that. Then Dylan. She did. She really did. Aurora looked at her conference room, the glass walls, the polished table, the city spread out beyond the windows at 40 floors, all the things she had built, and the particular familiar silence of having built them mostly alone. She looked at the drawing. She typed, "Tell her I'll bring the frame Saturday." She put her phone away and went back to work, and the drawing was still on her screen in her head the entire rest of the day. Those 3 labeled figures at a table, the handwriting of a child who had decided the question of family was already answered and had just been waiting for the adults to catch up. The frame Aurora brought on Saturday was slightly too large for the drawing. She'd bought it at an actual frame shop, not online, which meant she'd stood in the store for 12 minutes comparing options while the employee waited with the professional patience of someone accustomed to people taking picture framing more seriously than it warranted. She'd chosen a simple, dark wood one, clean lines, nothing ornate. She'd had the drawing matted in white because Sophie had used a lot of color and the white gave it room to breathe. When she arrived at the apartment and pulled it out of the bag, Sophie looked at it with wide eyes and then looked at Aurora with an expression that contained in equal measure genuine delight and the satisfaction of someone whose expectations had been confirmed. "You actually framed it," Sophie said. "I said I would." "Dad said you probably would, but he wasn't sure." Sophie looked at Dylan. "You said that." "I said there was a reasonable chance," Dylan said from the kitchen doorway. He was looking at the frame with an expression that he was working to keep neutral and not entirely succeeding. "Where do you want to hang it?" Sophie had opinions about this. The discussion about placement lasted 20 minutes and involved her walking to 4 different walls in the apartment with the frame held up, assessing the light and the visibility and what the drawing would be looking at from each position. She ultimately chose the hallway wall, the one you saw when you first came through the front door, and Dylan got a hammer and a nail while Aurora held the frame level and Sophie stood back directing with the focused authority of a project manager. When it was up, Sophie stood in front of it for a long moment. "It's good," she said. "It really is," Dylan said. He was standing close enough to Aurora that their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. And Sophie looked at the drawing and then looked at both of them with the small, private smile of a child who has been watching a story develop for months and is pleased with how the current chapter is going. Thus, the Harlan Voss situation ended, as Aurora had told Dylan it would, badly for Harlan Voss. It did not end quickly. Nothing involving teams of lawyers and financial regulators and a criminal investigation into corporate extortion ends quickly, and Aurora spent a significant portion of October in rooms she didn't want to be in, having conversations that were exhausting in the particular way of conversations where you are completely right and still have to keep proving it. Marcus Vail sat through most of them with her. Her lawyer, a woman named Celeste Park, who had been practicing corporate litigation for 22 years and had never once appeared to doubt herself, sat through all of them. The arbitration ruling came through on a Tuesday. Aurora was in her office when Celeste called. The ruling was comprehensive. Voss had lost the acquisition dispute, and the criminal referral related to Sophie's kidnapping had already produced 2 plea agreements from the men who'd been hired, agreements that named Voss directly and in specific detail. His board had been aware for a week that a resignation was the only option that protected the company's other investors, and they were applying pressure accordingly. Aurora sat in her office after the call and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows and felt not triumphant. She'd expected to feel triumphant. She felt mostly tired and relieved and ready to stop spending mental energy on Harlan Voss. She texted Dylan, "It's over. Voss is done." He texted back 3 minutes later. "How are you?" Not great, or congratulations, or any of the responses she'd been unconsciously bracing for. Just the question about her. "Tired," she wrote back. "But okay. Really okay." "Come for dinner," he wrote. "Sophie made a list of things she wants to tell you. It's long." Aurora looked at the city for another moment. Then she closed her laptop and told Nadine she was leaving early, which was an event unusual enough that Nadine wrote it down. That she had a conversation with her board in November. It had been building for a while. She'd felt it the way you feel a season changing, The slow accumulation of small signals that something is shifting. She had been pulling back from certain responsibilities since September, delegating more than she had in years, finding that the company's key operations ran fine, without her physical presence at every meeting, more than fine. She had built something that could sustain itself, which had always been the goal, and which she had somehow, in the daily pressure of running it, forgotten was a success rather than an abandonment. She sat in front of her board and told them she wanted to restructure her role. She was not stepping down, was not going anywhere, was still the majority shareholder, and would remain the strategic anchor. But she wanted to reduce her operational involvement by roughly 40% over the following year. She wanted a president installed to handle day-to-day management. She wanted to stop being the kind of CEO whose absence created a crisis and start being the kind whose absence was barely noticeable because she'd built the right systems. There was pushback. There was always pushback. Two board members suggested, in the careful language of people who have decided to be concerned rather than critical, that this represented a change in her priorities that they weren't sure aligned with the company's needs. One of them used the phrase distraction in her personal life, which he delivered looking at the table rather than at her, which told her everything she needed to know about how much he actually believed what he was saying. Aurora looked at him until he looked up. "I've delivered 11 consecutive quarters of returns above projection," she said. "I have never missed a board commitment. The strategic work that made this company what it is was done by a person who also had a life outside these walls, and the idea that I need to choose between doing my job well and having people I come home to is an assumption I'd encourage you to examine before you say it out loud again." The room was quiet. "I'm not asking for permission," she added. "I'm telling you what's happening. The question for this board is whether you want to be part of building the structure that makes it work, or whether you want to spend the next 30 minutes telling me why I'm wrong, and we can note that in the minutes." Nobody spent the next 30 minutes telling her she was wrong. What? December came with the specific quality of a year that had been long and broken in the middle, and had somehow, despite that, arrived at something worth being glad about. Sophie lost a tooth and gained strong opinions about a new book series. Dylan finished a project, not the contested bridge, but a smaller one, a pedestrian overpass in the city's east corridor, and he took Aurora and Sophie to see it on a gray Saturday afternoon, walking them across it and explaining the design choices with the focused enthusiasm that Sophie had learned to leverage socially as proof that her father was, in fact, interesting. Sophie walked the length of the bridge twice and then declared that she wanted to be an engineer. "I thought you wanted to be a paleontologist," Dylan said. "I can do both," Sophie said. "I'll dig things up and then build things on top of where I found them." "That's not exactly how either of those fields works," Dylan said. "I'll make it work," Sophie said, with the breezy confidence of someone who has not yet encountered a plan she couldn't adjust. Aurora stood in the middle of the pedestrian bridge and looked at the city below, and felt the structure hold her weight, and thought about a man who had once said he liked knowing things would hold, that what he built would matter in 20 years, 50 years, that there was something solid about it. She thought about what she was building, not the company. She'd been building that for 8 years, and she knew exactly what it was. Something else. Something that didn't have a financial model or a projection chart, that couldn't be optimized or leveraged, that was just this. A gray Saturday on a bridge in December, with a man pointing out load calculations to his daughter, who was not really listening but was also completely listening, and the city spread out in every direction, and the particular warmth of standing close to someone you trust. Dylan came and stood beside her while Sophie went back to the railing to look at something she'd spotted below. "It's a good bridge," Aurora said. "Yeah," he said. "It came out well." "How long did it take?" 14 months. There was a problem with the foundation survey about 6 months in that we thought was going to cost us 3 months of schedule, cost us 3 weeks. Because, he looked sideways at her, because I'd anticipated it might be an issue and run a secondary analysis before construction started, just in case. You built in a contingency. Always. "That's good engineering," Aurora said. "That's just experience," he said. "You do it long enough, you learn which problems announce themselves early and which ones try to hide. Once you can tell the difference, you stop being surprised." Sophie called from the railing, "There's a dog down there and it has a sweater." Dylan cupped his hands around his mouth. We're having a conversation. The sweater has a pattern on it. Sophie. It's a good pattern. Dylan turned back to Aurora. Where were we? Problems that try to hide, Aurora said. He looked at her for a moment with the clear-eyed, direct attention that she'd come to understand was just how he was. Not intense in an uncomfortable way, just present, fully present, in the way of someone who had made a decision to be somewhere and meant it. Yeah, he said quietly. I've gotten better at spotting those. She held his gaze. So have I. Below them, Sophie was providing a commentary on the dog's sweater to anyone within earshot. Above them, the sky was doing something complicated with clouds and pale winter light. The bridge held them easily, as bridges do, doing the thing it was built to do without making any particular show of it. Dylan's hand found hers, not dramatic, not announced, just his hand next to hers on the railing, and then holding hers, simple and certain. She held on. Matt. Sophie's 9th birthday came on the first Saturday of the following spring. Dylan had told Aurora about his plan 2 weeks earlier, sitting at the kitchen table after Sophie was in bed. He'd laid it out practically, the way he laid most things out. Here's what I'm thinking, here's why. Tell me if it's wrong. He wanted to take them back to Maison Alara. He'd called and gotten the same table, the corner one by the window. He'd called Sophie's grandmother, his mother, and 2 of Sophie's closest school friends and their parents. He wanted to recreate the night, or rather, and this was the part he'd said carefully, watching her face, he wanted to use it as a reference point, to show Sophie where things had started and where they were now. Aurora had said it sounded exactly right. She'd meant it. What she hadn't known, what she had genuinely not anticipated, which was unusual for her, was what Dylan had planned for the end of the evening. Maison Alara looked the same as it always had. The same lighting, the same quiet hum. The same sommelier who had witnessed from a discreet distance the original evening that had started all of this. Sophie arrived in a different dress, green this time, her current favorite color, and conducted herself with the gravity of someone at whose birthday people had gathered, which was exactly how Sophie approached most things. Dylan's mother, Margaret, was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, who had shaken Aurora's hand with the measuring grip of someone forming a comprehensive opinion and then smiled in a way that suggested the opinion was favorable. Sophie's friends occupied the end of the table and created their own contained ecosystem of 9-year-old social dynamics that required occasional adult intervention and generated intermittent bursts of laughter. Dinner was good. The same sea bass Aurora had ordered a year ago and barely touched was on the table again, this time fully eaten. Sophie negotiated the dessert situation exactly as she had the first time, with the same result: chocolate fondant, sea salt, center running when cut, and received it with the same vindicated expression. After dessert, Sophie's friends' parents gathered their kids for departure with the coordinated efficiency of parents who had agreed on a time and were sticking to it. Margaret kissed Sophie on the forehead, hugged Aurora with the brief firmness of a woman who does not perform affection, and found a reason to step outside. The restaurant had emptied around them in the deliberate way of spaces that have been given instructions about timing. Sophie was sitting next to Aurora, showing her something on a small notebook she'd been drawing in. Plans, Sophie called them, for a series of inventions she'd been developing, the specificity of which was impressive and the practicality of which varied significantly. Aurora was looking at a detailed sketch of something Sophie described as a weather predictor for dogs, a device that would tell dogs when it was about to rain so they could make an informed decision about going outside, when she noticed Sophie stop drawing. She looked up. Dylan was standing. He hadn't made a sound getting out of his chair. He was standing at the edge of the table, and he was looking at Aurora with an expression she had never quite seen on him before. Not the unguarded exhaustion of the parking lot, not the careful steadiness of the kitchen conversation, but something that was past all of that, past the careful and the guarded. Just Dylan with nothing in the way. Sophie had gone completely still beside her. Aurora understood, about 2 seconds before it happened, what was happening. Her heart did something that had nothing to do with calm. Dylan reached into his jacket pocket. "I want to say something," he said. His voice was steady, which she knew was not because he was comfortable, but because he had decided to be clear, and clarity was how he handled things that mattered. I spent 5 years being very sure I knew what our life was. Me and Sophie, what we needed, what we didn't, what made sense, and what was too complicated to be worth the trouble. He paused. And then a car broke down at the wrong time, and you walked across the street in shoes that were wrong for cobblestones. And Sophie told you her full name and her grandmother's nickname for her within 30 seconds of meeting you, because Sophie has never in her life met a stranger. Sophie, beside Aurora, made a small, dignified sound. And everything I thought I knew about what made sense, Dylan said, stopped being accurate. He was holding a ring, small and honest, a solitaire with a clean band, not a performance of wealth, just a ring that a person who noticed things had chosen for a specific person. That night, he said, you gave Sophie a birthday she still talks about. You gave me... He stopped, started again. I had stopped expecting to find someone who wanted into the actual thing, the small apartment, and the soccer games and the bridge explanations that go too long, and the kid who talks to strangers and tells you her grandmother's nickname and asks whether your date left because he was an idiot. His jaw was tight with effort. You wanted in, and when things got dangerous and complicated and I was angry, and it was all of it at once, you didn't want out. You stayed. Aurora's eyes were doing something she was not going to be able to prevent. I would like, Dylan said, to spend the rest of my life in whatever version of our life we build. Small or big. Complicated or simple. Whatever it ends up being. He took a breath. I would like you to be the person I call first, and the person Sophie draws into the family portrait. I would like the table to have you in it. He looked at the ring in his hand for 1 second. Aurora Sterling. Will you marry me? Sophie had stopped pretending to look at her notebook. Aurora looked at Dylan Mercer in the corner table of Maison Ilara, in the restaurant where a year ago she had sat alone and watched a man walk away before dinner even started, where she had looked out a window at a broken-down car and a little girl in a purple dress, and made an impulsive decision that had, by any reasonable metric, changed everything. She thought about Marcus Webb and his tailored jacket, and the particular kind of tiredness in his face when he'd looked at her and decided she was too much before he'd tried. She thought about the 8 years of people seeing the number and the title and the cover before they saw anything else. She thought about what it had felt like to walk across a street in the wrong shoes and be met with a direct question and an honest answer and a child who wanted to know if she was a nickname person. She thought about the drawing on the wall in the hallway of a small apartment. Dad, Aurora, me. She thought, Sophie already drew the ending. She just waited for us to catch up. Yes, she said. It came out steady, which surprised her. Dylan's face did the thing that faces do when relief and happiness arrive at the same time. Not a clean, composed expression, but the real version, slightly undone, completely unguarded. He came around the table and she stood up, and when he put the ring on her finger, his hands were not entirely steady, and she found that more reassuring than steadiness would have been. Sophie launched herself off her chair. She hit them both at approximately the same time, arms around Dylan's waist and Aurora's side, the three of them at the corner table by the window while the restaurant was quiet and the city moved outside the glass. I knew it, Sophie said into the vicinity of Aurora's ribs. You knew it, Dylan said. I told Grandma it would be at dinner. She said she wasn't sure. I was right. You were right, Aurora confirmed. I'm usually right, Sophie said, with the serene certainty of someone who has taken the long view and found it validated. The year that followed was not a postcard. That was the honest version. Aurora did not magically shed the weight of running a company worth several $billion because she was now engaged. And Dylan did not stop working long hours when a project demanded it. And Sophie was 9 and then 10, and had opinions about everything and strong feelings about certain foods that she'd previously been fine with and was suddenly not. And there were days, real days, when all three of them were tired and short with each other, and the small apartment felt like it had too many edges. There was a night in September when Aurora had been on back-to-back calls for 11 hours, and she arrived at the apartment late, and the dinner Dylan had made was cold and Sophie was already asleep, and she sat at the kitchen table and just stopped. Couldn't do the next thing, sat there with her coat still on. Dylan came and sat across from her and didn't say anything useful or inspiring. He said, "You want me to heat that up, or do you want to go straight to bed?" She said, "Heat it up." He did. He sat with her while she ate reheated pasta at 10:30 at night and didn't require conversation and didn't offer solutions, just was there in the specific, uncomplicated way that is actually one of the harder things to do for another person. She ate the whole bowl. She said, before she went to bed, "Thank you." He said, "Go to sleep." She went to sleep. There were also mornings when Sophie appeared in the kitchen before either of them had fully regained consciousness and declared that she had a plan for the day that required everyone's participation and couldn't be rescheduled. There were Saturday afternoons at parks and soccer games that Sophie's team won and lost in roughly equal measure. There were dinners that were actually good and dinners that were clearly the result of a long week and no one's best effort. There were conversations that needed to be had and took longer than expected and landed right eventually, but not without difficulty. It was ordinary. Fundamentally, persistently ordinary. Aurora had spent 8 years building something extraordinary and finding it in the quiet hours strangely insufficient. She had the extraordinary and kept waiting for it to feel like enough. The ordinary, it turned out, was what she'd been missing. Not the absence of achievement. She was still Aurora Sterling, still showed up for her board meetings and her strategic planning sessions, and was still, by most assessments, formidably good at her work. But she came home to something now. She came home to a kitchen table and a drawing in a hallway frame, and a man who asked her how she was, in a way that meant he actually wanted to know, and a child who told her everything on the drive from wherever they were to wherever they were going, in the unedited, unhierarchized way of a person who trusts you with the whole inventory. She came home. That was the thing. After 8 years of being very good at being alone, she came home. Sophie turned 10 in the spring. The birthday was different from the 9th, less formal, just family. A backyard, if you could call the small patch of outdoor space behind the house they'd moved into in January a backyard. Dylan had been resistant to the house at first, not because he didn't want it, but because the size of it relative to the apartment felt like accepting something he wasn't sure he'd earned. Aurora had pointed out, with characteristic directness, that they were going to be 3 people in a space that was currently sized for 2, and that Sophie needed her own room that wasn't also a homework space, and also a reading corner, and also a place where she kept her collections. Sophie had, by that point, developed several collections. The specifics of them were unclear even to the people who lived with her. Dylan had looked at the house. He'd walked through it the way he walked through structures, assessing, load-bearing, what holds and what might not. He'd said it was a good house. Aurora had thought he probably meant more than the construction. They'd moved in on a Saturday in January with the help of Dylan's mother and 2 of Dylan's work colleagues and a moving company that handled the larger items, and Sophie, who had appointed herself director of operations and took the role seriously. By the end of the day, the kitchen was set up and nothing else was, and they had eaten pizza on the floor of the living room surrounded by boxes. And Sophie had fallen asleep before 9, and they'd carried her to the one bedroom that was fully assembled. And Dylan and Aurora had sat against the wall in the half-dark living room with the boxes around them, and the house making its new house sounds, settling. "What do you think?" Dylan had said. "I think it's going to take a while to feel like ours," she'd said. "Yeah." He'd looked at the ceiling. "Probably worth it, though." "Yes," she'd said. "Probably." It had taken about 6 weeks, the way houses do. So on Sophie's 10th birthday, they were in the backyard, such as it was, a patch of grass and a wooden fence and a tree that Sophie had already climbed 3 times and was developing plans for. And Dylan had made food on an actual grill, which he did with the same combination of confidence and mild anxiety he brought to most things. And Margaret sat in a lawn chair with the authority of someone who had been told to relax and was willing to do so on her own terms. Sophie ran the length of the yard for no particular reason and came back and ran it again. She had gotten new shoes and wanted to break them in. Aurora sat on the back step with a glass of lemonade and watched the afternoon doing what spring afternoons do, all light and mild air and the feeling that the year has finally committed to being warm. Dylan came and sat on the step beside her, close. He smelled like charcoal smoke. The grill was at a temporary stage of not requiring attention. "She's had a good year," he said. "She has." Mostly because of you, he said. Mostly because of you, Aurora said. And her, she came ready. Dylan turned to look at his daughter sprinting the length of the yard for the third time, breaking in the new shoes with the systematic dedication of a professional. She's going to be something, he said. She already is, Aurora said. He was quiet for a moment. A comfortable quiet, the kind that had become their fluent language. Then, are you happy? She looked at him. Not a throwaway question. He'd asked it the way he asked things that mattered, with the full weight of wanting the real answer and being prepared to hear it even if it was complicated. She thought about it honestly, the way it deserved. She thought about the board meeting where she'd told two men that she was going to have a life, and that wasn't up for discussion, and the way it had felt to say it and mean it without apology. She thought about the crayon drawing in the hallway, and the pasta that was nothing special, and the bridge with its modified cable configuration, and the specific noise of a house with 3 people in it, imperfect and present and real. She thought about a broken-down car, and a purple dress, and 2 desserts, and the completely improbable sequence of wrong turns that had delivered her here to a back step in the late afternoon with charcoal smoke and lemonade, and Sophie testing the aerobic capacity of her new shoes. She thought about the years she'd had, the hard parts and the ordinary parts, and the parts that had surprised her. Yes, she said, simply, without qualifying it. I am. Dylan nodded like he'd already known but had needed to hear it. Good, he said. Sophie came to a stop in front of them, hands on her knees, catching her breath. The shoes are good, she announced. High praise, Dylan said. The left one's a little stiff, but it'll break in. She straightened up and looked at both of them on the step. What are you talking about? Whether you were going to wear those shoes out in one afternoon, Aurora said. I might, Sophie said with genuine consideration. She looked down at them, then at Aurora. You know what I was thinking? Tell me. At school, we're doing a thing about family history, like where your family comes from and what they did. She kicked one shoe against the other absently. I was thinking I have a lot to write about, like actual interesting stuff, not just where people are from. She looked up. Is that weird to say? No, Aurora said. That's not weird. Because some of it happened recently, Sophie said. Like, not generations ago, just, she shrugged, last year and the year before. Dylan said gently, that counts? Okay. Sophie seemed satisfied by this. She looked at the yard with the expression of someone preparing to run it again. Aurora, do you want to race? I'm in shoes that are wrong for racing. You always say your shoes are wrong. I have a consistent problem with footwear. Sophie grinned, wide, unguarded, the full version. She had Dylan's directness and her own specific quality of joy, the kind that doesn't calculate its own effect, that just happens because something is good and worth showing. Come on, she said. Aurora looked at the grass and her entirely unsuitable shoes, and Dylan beside her trying not to smile, and the late afternoon going golden at the edges, and she stood up. She raced Sophie across the backyard. She lost. Badly and genuinely, and without the complicated feeling of someone letting a child win. Sophie was fast and had excellent new shoes and was 9, 10 now, 10 years old today, and had the particular physical confidence of someone who has been running the length of things since she could walk. Sophie reached the fence first and turned around with her arms in the air. I won! You won, Aurora confirmed, slightly out of breath. Because your shoes are wrong, Sophie said generously. Because your shoes are right. Sophie considered this distinction. Both can be true, she said. Dylan laughed from the back step. Full laugh, the real version he saved for things that actually got him, head back, entirely unguarded. Aurora stood at the fence at the far end of the yard with her ridiculous shoes and her slightly disheveled composure, and she looked at the house. Their house, the one that had taken 6 weeks to feel like theirs, and at Dylan on the back step, and the grill doing its patient work, and Margaret in her lawn chair watching the whole thing with the small, satisfied expression of a woman who had raised someone worth knowing and was glad to see proof that it had been enough. She looked at Sophie beside her, vibrating with the satisfaction of having won something fair and square. She thought about a version of herself 1 year ago, sitting alone at the best table in a restaurant, watching a man walk away, making herself breathe through it. She thought about how that version of herself had understood loss but had quietly forgotten what it felt like to want something and find it, to reach for something and have it be real. Here was what she knew now, standing at the fence in the wrong shoes. The life that matters is not the one that impresses. It is not the one on the cover or in the portfolio or behind the glass of the 40th floor. It is the one where someone texts you that dinner is ready, where a child puts your name in a drawing and frames it in the hallway, where a man asks if you're happy and waits for the honest answer. The richest life is not measured in what you've built alone. It is measured in what you come home to. Aurora Sterling, who owned billions and had built an empire and had been on 3 magazine covers and had learned, finally, which problems announce themselves early and which ones try to hide, stood in a backyard in the wrong shoes and breathed the spring air and was, without qualification, exactly where she was supposed to be. Sophie grabbed her hand. "Come on," she said. "Dad's going to burn the chicken if we don't go back." "He's not going to burn the chicken," Aurora said. "He burned it last time." "I did not burn it," Dylan called from the step. "It was very dark," Sophie called back. "Dark is not burned. Dark is charring." "Charring is a technique." That's what someone who burned it would say. They walked back across the grass, Sophie pulling at Aurora's hand the way she always did, already talking about something new, the school project and the shoes, and something that had happened at recess that she'd been saving. And Aurora let herself be pulled, and the afternoon held them, and the year stretched ahead like a bridge someone had built to last. It would hold. She knew it would hold.